Morning, I am Susan Coffey. I am a qualified management accountant. I qualified in 2003. I started studying whilst working for American Express and then qualified whilst working for the International HIV/AIDS Alliance, which is an international development charity. I now run my own accountancy practice called Bright Accountancy, which I've been doing for a couple of years. So today I'm going to be presenting on budgeting in practice. I'd like to start by telling you a story about budgeting. It's about a young man called Seth Godin who was working as an intern for an American software house in the early 1980s. He was 24, an intern, and he was given a permanent position which was fantastic. But for his first job he was given no budget and no staff. What he had to do was convert science fiction novels into software games, literary software games. So he had to do this with no budget and leverage resources within the organisation. So what he did was twice weekly he put together a newsletter that he distributed to everybody in the organisation. It started off, there were only about 30 employees, but it grew, there were about 100. And within the first month, he had 6 people working for him, some of them moonlighting after work voluntarily on his project. And within 6 months, everybody within the department was working for him. Again, some of them voluntarily after work. And a month before the shipping deadline, 30 of them slept in the office for 30 nights to get this project done. And they eventually shipped 5 products, millions of copies to market, and they actually saved the company from going under. Now, I think it's a remarkable story about budgeting, and the reason is because he managed to get something done outside of the budgeting process, and he managed to get something remarkable, creative and brilliant done. And the reason for that was the culture of the organisation allowed him to do that. So budgeting, as I'm hopefully going to show you, is a really essential part of any business infrastructure. But one of the things you want to make sure it doesn't do is lock down creativity and innovation within the organisation. So some of you will recognise there, I've used the McKinsey 7S framework. We're going to look at strategy, structure, systems, staff, skills, shared culture and style of leadership, all in relation to budgeting. And as we go through, I would like you to consider 2 key questions that for me really embody the challenges of budgeting in modern day organisations. And the first one is around SMEs. And I want to ask you, how would you encourage a reluctant owner-manager to start budgeting? And how would you recommend that they'd actually do that? And the second question is for larger, more established, mature organisations. How would you encourage innovation and innovative management whilst working with using budgeting as one of the main control functions within that organisation? So we'll start off with strategy and a definition that I've put together myself. The first one, it's a financial goal or plan covering a defined period of time. And as with any goal or plan, it has to be SMART. So it has to be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic and time-bound. And I've also put in there the CIMA official terminology handbook definition, which is similar, just more definitive around the sorts of things that will be measured. So what do budgets actually do? Well, they communicate to an organisation what the direction of that organisation is going to be. They define the organisation's direction. They legitimise business activity. So is it in the budget? If it's not going to happen. They motivate staff, hopefully. They keep an organisation on track through the management accounts. The budget will be presented in the management accounts, possibly on a monthly basis. The actuals will be analysed in relation to the budget, and variance analysis used to see if the organisation is on track, and if it's not, remedial action will need to be taken. And for many organisations, literally the only reason they will do a budget and a business plan is to help secure funding for that organisation. So CIMA has put together a document called Beyond Budgeting, which is a range of tools and techniques, including things like the balanced scorecard, shareholder value analysis and rolling forecasts, that they see as an answer to the problems with traditional budgeting. They identify that traditional budgeting was something that came about in the 1920s, focusing very much on costs and cash flows. And they say that by the 1960s, that method of traditional budgeting had become very much fixed contracts between senior management and subordinates. And they say there are very serious limitations to that method of command and control style budgeting. They rarely focus on strategy and can often be very contradictory, are very time-consuming to put together. You could have whole organisations literally being run by the budget process, and costly to put together. They constrain responsiveness and flexibility, often deter change, add little value, especially given the time taken to put together, focus on cost reduction rather than value creation, and, as I said, strengthen that vertical command and control style structures of an organisation. Now, I think we may be getting ahead of ourselves with many organisations if we start talking about beyond budgeting. Many organisations do not do budgeting. Simply Business did some research in 2010 and found that 54% of businesses are not budgeting. Now, I've talked with other management accountants in practice about this, and we thought it was probably nearer to 95%. And we come across a lot of SMEs and are very aware of which ones are and aren't budgeting. So anecdotally, that is what we've actually found. And you may think, well, so what? What does it matter? Well, SMEs, there's about 4.5 million of them in the UK. They make up about 50% of private sector turnover. That's a total of about £1.5 billion combined turnover. And they employ about 60% of private sector employees. So I think if all of those businesses are not budgeting, that's a serious problem, and there's a huge room for improvement of those organisations. Now, 66% of businesses actually fail within the first year. And the reasons they fail are things like cash flow management, lack of finance, lack of financial expertise, lack of focus, lack of insurance, lack of market knowledge, a reliance on a very small number of customers, lack of resources, tax bills that they hadn't foreseen or even thought about, and finally incompetence. Now, I think there's very few of those that couldn't actually be really dealt with by a good business plan and a budget. I mean, incompetence you're probably not going to sort out, but budgeting can't do everything. So moving on to a structured approach. Now, the starting place for any budget has to be an organisation's business plan, starting right at the top. It's what's saying the business is going to be doing. And there are many opportunities and options for businesses. The business has to decide which opportunities and options it is taking up before doing a budget. Otherwise, you could waste a lot of time exploring very many different avenues. The budget then disseminates that information across the organisation. It should then fit into personal development plans. It should be part of the appraisal process, and it's that way that people are held accountable to that budget and make sure that it's implemented. Finally, you need to have structured timeframes that everybody is aware of. Whether it's annual or rolling, it needs to be something that's clear. Systems used to track budgeting. The first one is It's in My Head, which is obviously a very accessible system to use, but only for one person. It's not going to be in anybody else's head. It's not communicable, and there are several limitations with it, which I'm hoping you can work out for yourselves. We're moving on to a napkin, which is, it's great to get something down on a bit of paper, the back of a fag packet, a scrap of paper. But again, it has to be a starting point, and from there you've got to move on to something a bit more structured. I think Excel is probably the most accessible system around for most organisations. It's really easy to use, and if you can't use it, it is very cheap to go on a training course. It's very, very flexible. You can use it to put together a one-page business plan, or you can start to do really sophisticated modelling bespoke for that organisation. You could use specialised budgeting software such as Sage 50 Forecasting, and I have a colleague, a management accountant in practice, who uses this for her management accountancy clients. And some of them use Sage Accounting, and if they do, she can download that information straight into this software and use the actuals as a basis for budgeting, which is what you need to do. You need to be keeping things real from where you're actually at the beginning point. You can also, if you don't use Sage Accounting, you can put the figures in a trial balance format, so you can still start off using the actual figures. And finally, something like a bespoke budgeting software for your organisation. It's potentially a very expensive option and also quite risky. You have to make sure that the software is going to have longevity. You don't want to be paying out for a piece of software that actually you find out is only going to be relevant to your organisation for a couple of years when the payback period is actually 5 years. And you have to write that obsolete software off. Staff that need to be involved. It really does, in my opinion, need to be everybody in the organisation buying into the budget process. It needs to be the senior management at the top, setting the budgets. The finance team have a very, very key role. Management accountants have a key role in implementing and putting the budget together. They will be liaising between senior management, distributing the budget targets, possibly helping people with templates, teasing information out of people into those templates, and challenging people on what they've actually put in the budget and pulling things together and possibly pulling that information together, reporting back to senior management. Skills required. Now, some of the skills required wouldn't immediately be obvious. Things like communication. In that sort of linchpin role that management accountants have, they really do have to be good communicators. They need to understand the budget parameters, what the senior management want, what the business plan is about, and then they have to be able to communicate that to everybody in the organisation. They have to be very good at coordinating. You need to have good coordination skills to get a budget completed. You need to meet with lots of managers on tight deadlines. You need to be able to organise that and get it completed. You need to have a really good understanding of your organisation's methodology and terminology, and it's amazing how different organisations can be from each other. You need diplomacy. Now, I've worked for several charities and arts organisations, and in those organisations, finance is not the leading decision-making factor. They have charitable aims and artistic direction, and a management accountant will need to be very clear on being able to communicate financial implications of decisions, but they cannot direct those decisions. There needs to be a really good understanding of roles, of all everybody needs to understand their roles, and a management accountant needs to be very clear on what everybody's role is and help them to understand that role. And finally, training. I personally think that management accountants need to be excellent trainers because they are going to be supporting people in their role throughout the organisation. People who may be very senior in their roles, who maybe are not new to that organisation or possibly are new to actually managing a finance but suddenly find themselves managing a significant budget. So they need to be able to coach people, mentor people and help them to be able to do their job. Now, culture is something that can often be seen as intangible. It's really about the way we get things done around here. So how do things work? I think Griner's growth model is a really useful way of thinking about culture and how it affects the budgeting process. So you could have an organisation right down at the bottom, literally a startup. You may have 1 or 2 employees and a very creative, informal environment. They could literally sit down in a room, they could do the budget, and they could communicate it to the whole organisation in that one meeting. At the top of the graph, you could have a multinational organisation with thousands of employees, obviously requiring a very different sort of budgeting process. Many more people involved, much more formal structures. Now, I want to look at some case studies. And the first one is American Express, where I worked for about 7 years. Absolutely fantastic company to work for. In the States, they're often voted one of the top companies to work for, and I would really vouch for them. They were formed in 1850, a very, very mature organisation. They have 80,000 employees, and it doesn't get much bigger than that. Their brand is worth £15 billion, and in terms of their budgeting process, very, very strategically led. The CEO, when I was there, was Harvey Golub. It's now Ken Chenault. His name was very, very familiar to me. His thought leadership was strongly communicated through the organisation so that we were all very aware of what our roles were. This is my goals. It's a 9-page document. I was a middle management professional there, and I had an annual goal process, and as you can see, it's a 9-page document communicating to me my role in implementing the budgeting process. It was an annual process, very much driven from a central department. There were several other departments across the organisation in different business areas responsible for pulling budgets together and tracking those budgets throughout the year using management accounts. When I worked there, I worked in one of the departments, was the Europe, Middle East and Africa Technologies Project Office, and I worked for 2 senior technologies leaders managing a combined budget of $24 million. My role was to liaise with those department heads and project managers to pull their budgets together and report back to central finance. The challenge I had was we used Excel. We were issued with templates in Excel at department level. The budgets I was looking at after were very much along the lines of project level. And at the time, American Express was outsourcing various resources. So any project could be resourced using employees, contractors, offshore resources, onshore resources. And every single project had to be analysed and various scenarios decided on. Then what I had to do was translate the project budgets into the department level. And it was a lot of manual intervention by me, and at the time I did find it was difficult and it was a big challenge. And in hindsight, I think it was probably a very good solution using manpower to solve that problem, because they could have designed a piece of software which may have solved the problem for a period of time, but it might not have had longevity. That problem probably would have gone away in a few years, or things would have changed, structures would have changed, and the software would have been obsolete. So in hindsight, it was a very good solution. In terms of Griner's model, it's a highly collaborative budgeting process at American Express. There was no way that anyone in the organisation could have pulled that budget together. I couldn't have pulled the budget together for the departments I was looking after, and they couldn't have done it without my coordination. So highly collaborative. The next case study I'm going to talk about is the International HIV/AIDS Alliance. They were formed in 1993. When I started working for them in 2003, they were enjoying their 10th anniversary. They, at the time, had an income of about $15 million, and when I joined, about 50 employees. And it was a really different sort of organisation to American Express. And when I joined, I would say in terms of Griner's model, they were very much going through a crisis of creativity. They'd been around, as I said, for 10 years. Up till then, they had been able to sit in one room, the whole staff for the organisation, and get their budget completed. And one of the first meetings I had when I went to the organisation was a meeting in a room with every member of staff completing the budget. If anybody had anything to say, any amendments, any questions, they could just put their hand up and have their input. It was a very, very big culture shock for me coming from American Express. It was very exciting as well. Now, in terms of the crisis of creativity, that was because during the period of time I was there, the staff grew to over 100. There was no way anymore that they could actually have a meeting with everybody in the organisation. Similarly, the income grew. It is now up to $100 million annually. The way the organisation works is they obtain grants from large donor organisations such as USAID, DFID, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and then they onward grant those to small linking organisations in developing countries. It's a huge amount of financial risk, reporting, and the financials really had to be strengthened and professionalised. When I was there, because there were so many changes and grants were being granted literally on a weekly basis, the income would change. We did look at rolling budgets, 6-monthly rolling, and I have to say I really did feel that that would be difficult to manage within an organisation where you already have a challenge to make sure that everybody understands the budget and can manage their financial role. The idea of actually changing that on such a frequent basis and tracking that did seem to be a huge challenge. Now, I've spoken with the current director, and what they now do is they have a fixed annual budget with a 3-year rolling budget. So they've taken the benefits of the rolling budget, but they still have the certainty of that fixed annual budget. Now, moving on to style of leadership. These are 2 photographs I took in 2007 of the Royal Shakespeare Theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon. I worked there from 2005 till 2008, and this is literally at the start of the transformation project. The transformation project was started in 2005 in terms of thinking about it, and it had a budget of £112 million. Now, when these pictures were taken, half of that funding had been secured by the senior management. And you can imagine at that point they may have been feeling a little nervous. They had this project to implement, and they'd actually started it, and they still had half of that funding to secure. Now, this is the completed transformation. It's absolutely fantastic, and it is a transformation. And I think the learning for me for this in terms of style of leadership is that style has to be inspirational. And budgets and budgeting process enable visionary leaders to implement their visions and bring everyone across the organisation with them. Okay, thank you.